with, first of all, thanking you, Jason, for inviting me. It gave me an opportunity to go back and think about my arguments and evolution that I have covered since then. And I want to thank you for it. My observations indicate that there are participants in this class who are familiar with the paradox of observing. And basically, I explained it before that the paradox of observing consists in the fact that observer is embedded in the act of observing. And of course, the observer brings the subjective views and subjective choices into the act of observation. And there are quite a few researchers, contemporary researchers, who think that this paradox is real, and it makes an objective representation of reality difficult, if not indeed impossible. There are also those who disagree and who claim that reproducibility and replicability of experiments make this paradox a non-issue. However, despite these claims, the problem persists. The problem of objectivity persists. It merely shifts the controversy from paradox of observing to reproducibility and replicability. People express their doubts whether reproducibility and replicability are adequate criteria for objectivity. Let me cite just one brief quote from the book called Reproducibility and Replicability in Science that was published by National Academies in 2019. And it says, concerns about reproducibility and replicability have been expressed in both scientific and popular media. I can cite other people. I don't want to, flood you with citations, but I can cite Heisenberg, I can cite Bohr, and I can cite other people. I just recently saw an article entitled from Weizmann Institute, Quantum Theory Deconstructed, Observation Affects Reality. So there you go. But be that as it may, I'm not taking sides at this point in this debate. The article that has attracted the attention of the organizers of this forum, The Paradox of Observer, Autopoiesis, and the Future of Social Sciences, appeared almost 15 years ago. And my views on the subject that I address in this article have significantly evolved since then. I've in many ways modified my original arguments, developed new arguments, and introduced new terminology. However, the core of the argument remains the same. There is obviously little sense in going back to the original article and simply rehash my original arguments. Therefore, I've decided to include in this presentation some results of my evolution since the publication of the original article. But first, let me go back to the original article. The main problem that the original article addresses is the problem of objectivity. This problem has a long history, yet despite the fact that much has been written on the subject, the problem still remains unresolved and continues to generate a great deal of controversy. The article focuses on the paradox created by what seems to be the inevitable embeddedness of the observer into the act of observing. This embeddedness brings the observer's subjectivity into the act of observing, thus affecting the outcome. There is still no definite solution to this problem, only palliatives. Although rational justification and empirical verification, the two palliatives that are commonly used, at least to some extent constrain subjectivity, neither of them completely eliminates its influence. Rational justification privileges an anthropocentric perspective on objectivity, rationality. Empirical verification still depends on subjective choices in the selection of a frame, observables, and the tools of observation. Subjectivity appears to be ineluctable. There are two principal sides to this debate, and I know that the terms may not be, not everyone may share these terms, but these are the terms that I borrowed from social sciences, and it's representationalists and anti-representationalists. Both recognize ineluctability of subjectivity, both. Anti-representationalists maintain that since reality is not directly accessible to human mind, and for this reason has to be mediated by and refracted through mental constructs, we cannot make any hegemonic claims regarding the objectivity and veracity of our knowledge. Even representationalists who maintain that empirical facts belong to a non-discursive reality, and for this reason, constrain the impact of subjectivity, argue that we can attain only infinite asymptotic approximations to reality, not observe reality as it is. And representationalists and anti-representationalists are not alone in recognizing this embeddedness of the observer into the act of observing. This recognition has also gained wide acceptance in our intellectual community and our culture in general. Quantum physics, theory of relativity are just two good examples. Many contributors on the subject of objectivity agree on one point. In order to attain the objective representation of reality, we should observe the act of observing. By observing the observing, we can identify biases and make appropriate correctives. But how can we do it? Many regard such observing as impossible and simply leading to infinite regress. I can cite one name, Niklas Luhmann, for example, brings up this issue. The set of questions that sparked my initial interest in this subject was this: is there a position from which we can observe the observer without relying on subjective choices and without falling into the trap of infinite regress? Can we access this position? That was my initial question that sparked my initial interest. Mental constructs make our perception, observation, and interpretation of reality possible. Looking at the emergence of mental constructs seemed like at me at the time, like a logical first step in search for a solution of the paradox of observing. How do mental constructs emerge? What is the process that is involved in their emergence? In search for answers to these questions, I turned to Piaget and his study of the origin of human intelligence. Those of you who are familiar with my original article know that in addressing the origin of subjectivity, I rely heavily on the work of Jean Piaget, particularly his study on the origin of intelligence in children. There is no need to describe in detail Piaget's study. I have included such descriptions in my original article and several other pieces that I wrote since then. Rather, I want to draw your attention to one important, albeit not entirely intended, contribution that Piaget makes in his study. The focus of the origin of intelligence is the emergence of mental images in children's mind during the first year of their life. Mental images represent a new level of organization that does not exist prior at the time of birth. The emergence of this new level of organization is obviously a result of some process. Piaget focuses on this process. In doing so, he forgoes the traditional atomistic approach that seeks to identify fundamental building blocks, rather than attempt to explain mental images in terms of some fundamental building blocks that precede their emergence and bear their defining properties. Piaget shifts the focus to the process that creates mental images and their unique properties. Piaget abandons the notion that such defining feature or features have pre-existed mental images. He looks at the emergence of mental images as an act that creates their properties. He does not base his search on some foundational assumptions. He fixes his gaze on what children actually do as the empirical reality that precedes the rise of mental images. According to Piaget, the level of organization that sustains mental images emerges from the level of organization that sustains sensory motor operations, such as audio, visual, olfactory, gustatory, and tactile. Conservation is the key to understanding this process. Sensory motor operations are mere reflexes. As Piaget has observed, initially, children indiscriminately perform these operations as a way of conserving them through repeated actions. Such indiscriminate application of sensory motor operations have no purpose, but they do produce results. They make operations more stable and thus conserve them. Excuse me. In the course of conserving themselves, sensory motor operations create combinations with each other. This new form of organization combines their differences, audio, visual, and so forth. Because they include differences, these combinations of sensory motor operations represent a new level of organization that is more powerful than the one from which it has emerged. This level of organization offers sensory motor operations more possibilities, more degrees of freedom, and more opportunities to act and thus conserve themselves. This new and more powerful level of organization gives rise to and sustains mental images. Mental images reflect sensory motor operations, but they do a lot more than that. They regulate and enrich sensory motor operations with new possibilities, thus making them more stable and conserving them better. The rise of permanent mental images is an unintended and unsought for result of conservation of sensory motor operations. According to Piaget's intention, although Piaget's intention was to explain the emergence of mental images, he made a discovery that had, in my view, much broader relevance. He has discovered a process that results in the creation of a new and more powerful level of organization that is more powerful than the one from which it has emerged. There is every reason to believe that this process operates at other levels of organization in human mind. Piaget did not follow the atomistic approach. He did not attempt to disassemble mental images into their constituent parts and then identify some fundamental properties that made these images possible. Instead, he followed his intuition and looked at the actions of his subjects who performed these actions, and that resulted in the rise of permanent mental images, making thus an evolutionary leap towards symbolic mental operations possible. The emergence of mental images make this leap possible. The use of the word creation in this case is not an accident or a mistake, it is deliberate. I use this word in the sense in which we use it in relation to various forms of art, not in the religious sense of creation ex nihilo. In this former sense, the word implies continuity. In my sense, in the sense that I use the word creation, it implies both continuity and discontinuity that are both characteristic for an act of creation, just like in art, for example. I have to say that Piaget was criticized a lot for his other achievements and stages of children development and whatnot. But interestingly, this aspect has not been really prominently criticized, the discovery of this process. For example, one of his most visible critics was Noam Chomsky, who, for example, also offered his own explanation for the emergence of human intelligence by invoking what he calls generative grammar. The term clearly indicates that what Chomsky has in mind is some process that generates. What was that? Okay. Invoking what he calls generative grammar. The term clearly indicates that there's some process involved, and that this process follows certain rules, grammar. In contrast to Piaget, however, Chomsky's term has a distinct anthropocentric connotation. Also, unlike Piaget, Chomsky has not elaborated what the pattern of his grammar is. Finally, he has not explained how this pattern originated. He simply refers to it as innate and leaves it at that. So how does Piaget discovery contributes to resolving the paradox of observing and the problem of objective representation? The mental constructs that we use in observing and interpreting reality are products of the process of creation. In other words, the process of creation makes observing possible. In performing any observation, including observation of observing, we have no choice but to rely on the process of creation that creates these constructs. It is what makes our observation possible. Moreover, the process of creation offers a point from which we can observe reality, including the process of creation itself, without relying on subjective choices. As has already been indicated, combining differences is central to the process of creation. Combining difference is essentially a form of equilibration. The increase in equilibrium is a natural result of equilibration. However, combinations of differences also create a new and more powerful level of organization. The emergence of the new and more powerful level of organization creates disequilibrium, and that requires subsequent re-equilibration. As equilibrium grows, so does disequilibrium. This balance between equilibrium and disequilibrium regulates and conserves the process of creation. Regulation is essentially a reflective operation. It reflects the entire process that it regulates. Therefore, the point of balance between equilibrium and disequilibrium offers a possibility of observing the entire process of creation without resorting to subjective choices. This point of reflection exists in the process of creation and is not a result of a subjective choice of the observer. Therefore, I drew conclusions. Since the process of creation meets the principal condition for objectivity, it offers a possibility of objective representation of reality. In other words, we can observe reality without relying on subjective choice. The process of creation also passes the test of rational justification and empirical verification. There are conditions for constraining subjectivity. The process of creation is logically necessary. One can attempt to construct an argument that the process of creation is not logically necessary, but rather than create a paradox, this argument turns on self-contradiction. The very fact of its construction proves the necessity of the process that constructs it. It will merely be self-contradictory. It will deny its own validity since it will be a result of the process of creation. Thus, its denial merely affirms the process of creation. On the empirical side, we can see that without creating our mental constructs, we would not be able to observe, interpret, or talk about reality. Our universe offers a great deal of evidence from particles to atoms to stars, galaxies, and planets to life and civilization that shows the process of creation at work. There are also numerous examples that illustrate human capacity to create new works of art, literature, music, social and political systems, scientific theories, and much, much else. Piaget's theory, let me shift, I forgot to shift to
the right page.
Yeah, let me see. Paradox of observing, let's see. Let's see. Okay. We sort of finished with Piaget, and I moved to the next one. So Piaget's theory has clear let's see, where was I? Okay, has evolutionary implications. Piaget describes a process that creates new level of organization, new and more powerful level of permanent mental images. This process originates in conservation that is intrinsic to sensory motor operations. Conservation leads to combining different sensory motor operations, and the result is the emergence of new and more powerful level of organization. This new level of organization is totally unintended. I need to wet my throat. It is a result of spontaneous conservation drive. Although Piaget's intention was to explain the emergence of mental images, his study has made a discovery that has much broader relevance. He discovers a process that results in the creation of a new level of organization that is more powerful than the one that has emerged. The evolutionary implications of this discovery are obvious. After all, what is the evolution? What evolution is largely about the rise of new and increasingly more powerful levels of organization nested in each other. Matryoshka, this is Russian doll that one fits into the other, Matryoshka style. We are part of this reality. We're products of its evolution. The process of creating new and increasingly more powerful levels of organization is integral to this evolution. The evolution is the only source from which we could have inherited this capacity to create new levels of organization. Since the evolution of nature is part of the evolution of the universe, we can extend the observation about broader relevance of the process of creation to the entire universe. Piaget has shown that the process that leads to the emergence of mental images originates in conservation. Conservation is ubiquitous throughout the universe and manifests itself at all levels of organization of reality. Its roots lie in the very nature of our universe. Our universe is very unique. It is all there is. I know there are theories that say it differently, but that I don't want to get into this digression. It's all, as far as we are concerned, and what we can observe, it's all there is. Nothing can come into it from outside, nothing, because there is no outside. Nothing can disappear from it because there is nowhere to disappear. Everything must be conserved. Without conservation, the universe simply cannot exist. And conservation and the creation are integral to each other. Piaget has examined the process of creation largely in the context of human mind. His efforts to extend his discovery to other contexts have been very limited. He, for example, wrote a book, Behavior and Evolution. It is perhaps one of the few rare examples of such effort. I have attempted the examination of the process of creation in the context of both the evolution of nature, in my article that offers re-examination of Darwinian theory, and in the evolution of the universe. I can give references to both these pieces later. Although the details in each context are very different, the fundamental pattern, conservation, combinations, creation of new and more powerful levels of organization, and evolution remains the same. I would only add a few features to the pattern described by Piaget, although Piaget mentions them in his work. These features include the creation of aggregations of similar parts with subsequent differentiation of such aggregations that gives rise to differences. In other words, the process of creation also creates differences because the universe starts with essentially homogeneous particles, similar particles. The articles I wrote was about 15 years ago, concludes that it is possible to observe the observing from the point that does not rely on subjective choice. Observing the observing makes an objective representation of reality possible. It is important to note that I do not argue that this approach guarantees an objective representation, but only that it makes a representation possible. Since the publication of my article, my initial interest in this subject has evolved in ways that I have not envisioned at the time of my writing. This evolution has led me to the realization that the persistence of the controversy over objectivity points to a much deeper and more serious problem. In the course of this search for the solution to the paradox of observing, I have come to understand the importance of conservation and the process of creation. Conservation drives the process of creation. The process of creation makes conservation possible. This complementary relationship gives rise to new and increasingly more powerful levels of organization. The evolution that results from the emergence of these new levels sustains reality and makes possible our universe and everything in it, including our civilization and knowledge, possible. Evolutionary change is essential for conservation. What does not evolve begins to disintegrate. The study of the process of creation shows that this process works on inclusion. Inclusion is the essential feature of this process. Based on this recognition, one would expect that inclusion should be integral to everything that the process of creation generates. Yet, strangely enough, our science practice appears to be very different in this regard. It seeks to exclude differences rather than include them. As the controversy over objectivity shows, the dominant view in our scientific community is that subjective biases are the main obstacles to objective representation of reality. As such, biases have to be identified, suppressed, if not completely eliminated. Subjective biases represent differences. Therefore, efforts to suppress subjective biases seeks to exclude differences. This exclusionary practice is manifestly at odds with the process of creation that requires inclusion. In accordance with the process of creation, we should welcome subjective biases and the differences they represent as an opportunity to create new and more powerful levels of mental organization that would help us identify new properties, would give rise to new ideas, approaches, and theories. Yet, contrary to this expectation, our science emphasizes commonalities rather than differences. It tries to shun and exclude differences. In other words, our science practice does not foster the creation of new and increasingly more powerful levels of organization, thus impeding progress in knowledge production. It makes conservation difficult, if not impossible. The controversy over objectivity indicates the presence of a deeper problem of exclusion that is characteristic for our science practice and social practice more generally. Science practice is inseparable from a broader social and cultural context. Scientists are not a race apart. They display many of the same attitudes and affinities as the rest of our society. Exclusion is a characteristic feature of our social and political practice more generally. And as the current crisis and problems of our civilization process today show, its effects are just as detrimental, if not more so. The conclusion that inevitably follows from this discussion is that our social practice is at odds with conservation and the process of creation. This opposition cannot but have a negative effect on our knowledge production and its progress. The contradiction cannot be more glaring. The process of creation is the source of our knowledge, yet the practice that we can consciously pursue is at odds with this process. This conclusion gives rise to a broader question. Why is our consciousness inimical to the process that has created it? Why do we see differences as a threat rather than an opportunity? There is only one answer to this question. We see differences as a threat because we do not understand their value. And the reason why we do not understand their value is due to the fact that the process of creation is not central to our view of reality. We do not embrace it. We do not understand this process and the way it works. Only under these conditions, differences appear as a threat rather than opportunity. We do not know what to do about differences, and therefore we seek to exclude them. As the current crisis in our civilization and the unresolved problems we face show the continued failure to embrace the process of creation and the practice of exclusion, continued practice of exclusion that follows from this failure, makes sustaining our civilization extremely difficult. There is only one solution to this conundrum. We have to bring our social practice, including knowledge production, in conformity with the two fundamental pillars that sustain reality and the universe: conservation and the process of creation. We should not seek to suppress differences. Rather, we should seek to integrate and transcend them by creating a broader frame that would include all differences as particular cases. That is, cases that are true under specific conditions or assumptions. What will this new practice involve? By the way, I wanted to draw your attention to this slide here, and it shows very schematically, in a very simplified manner, how the process of creation works. We have two operations, A and B, each of which has access to two operations, either A or not A, either act or not act, or B or not B. When you combine these two operations, each of them has access to four. Look, it has access to four operations, and of which the most important one is not A and not B, because that opens the gate for many other possibilities that transcend the current capacity of the system. That's what helps the system recognize what it is not and connect to it. Now, say the main criteria for objectivity.
Seems to me you have made your
point. Yeah. This is good. This is what it should be. What will this practice involve? What will it be like? In order to answer these questions, we must briefly review what we know about the process of creation. First, the process of creation is intrinsic to reality. It is real. Its source is conservation that is ubiquitous throughout the universe. We have also direct physical evidence that this process exists. Our mind, our consciousness are all results of this process. It passes rational justification, it passes empirical verification. This process, we know, works on inclusion. It also maintains a balance between equilibration and the production of disequilibrium. It also maintains a balance between hierarchical and non-hierarchical interactions. Non-hierarchical interactions among equals create new levels of organization, and hierarchical interactions are also essential because they conserve and optimize these creations. The process of creation, and we need balance because when either one of these dominates, it disrupts the whole system. The process of creation generates new and increasingly more powerful levels of organization. These levels of organization gives rise to new objects, forms, ideas, approaches, etc. Each level regulates and conserves the level from which it has emerged. Each level is regulated by another level that has emerged from it. There is no doubt that there is more to be learned about the process of creation, but even what we know now offers some outline for the new practice. So what will this new practice look like? First, let me see. Okay. This new social practice will be inclusive. It will include all differences. It will involve the process of creation, because in order to include differences, you have to create a broader frame in which all these differences will represent particular, including your own, by the way, will represent particular cases. That is, cases that are true under specific conditions. Inclusion involves equilibration. We must understand what equilibration is. Equilibration is not aggregation of differences. It's it involves creative process. Equilibration produces disequilibrium. Equilibration and the production of equilibrium are in balance in the process of creation. The process of creation maintains a balance between these two. Therefore, our explanations or representations of reality should focus on the process of equilibration and the production of disequilibrium. We need to explain what has been involved in the process of equilibration, what kind of disequilibrium this equilibration has produced. We should also explain how the process of equilibration evolves and what the results of this evolution are, both intermediate and final. Balance between hierarchical and non-hierarchical interactions also is essential. Each has a role. Non-hierarchical interactions create new levels of organization, and hierarchies conserve and optimize these creations. Maintaining the balance between hierarchical and non-hierarchical interaction will require new approaches and methods in management and leadership that will prevent the domination of one type of interactions over another. Something we see today is domination of hierarchies over non-hierarchical interactions. One of the most serious problems we face today is due to this domination. Since the process of creation is primarily about producing new and increasingly more powerful levels of organization, levels of organization will be the primary objects of investigation in the new practice. Each level regulates the level from which it has emerged, and it is in turn regulated by the level that emerged from it. In explaining reality, the new practice will not need to look for an explanation of particular level of organization in some fundamental building blocks of reality or some fundamental levels of organization of reality. There are no such fundamental building blocks. Each level of organization regulates the one from which it has emerged and gives rise to another level that regulates it. Therefore, in explaining some part of reality that we focus on, all we need to do is to focus on three adjacent levels of organization that are connected to each other by the bonds forged by the process of creation. Inclusiveness, also for this practice character, inclusiveness will be one very important criterion, in addition to others, in validating knowledge, how inclusive our knowledge is. Finally, an integral part of this practice will be education. That is to say, we have to help students. I believe that all humans have the capacity to perform the process of creation. All of us created our own consciousness. All of us created our own intelligence. And we do it in the first year of our life. And that is enormous. I don't think our science today can explain this process, but it does happen. And that testifies to the enormous creativity. If we help students establish control over those properties, over those actions that allow them to exercise their capacity to create, we will render them enormous help. So we have to, our education should enhance this capacity and enable students to control it, and not just to transfer knowledge, but also give them these important skills. This practice, and I'm finally at the end, this practice will offer certain advantages by comparison with our current practice. It opens possibility of objective representation. Since the new practice is inclusive, it does not generate tensions and conflicts. Exclusion is the source of inequality and domination. As such, exclusion leads to tensions and conflicts that disrupt the evolution of our society and its progress, including the progress in the production of knowledge. This new practice will make possible to balance hierarchical and non-hierarchical interactions and preclude the domination of one over the other. Finally, this practice will value, let me see, advantages. Yeah, I forgot to shift it. Yeah. Finally, I did. Finally, this practice will value differences. It will not view differences as disruptive. It will welcome differences, both present and future differences, as opportunities to conserve what has been achieved and move forward. And I thank you for your attention. I probably took a little more time than I should have. I hope it was